The wagon wheels groaned against the rocky trail, each rotation carrying Clara Elwood further from everything she had ever known. Red dust swirled in the October wind, coating her traveling dress and stinging her eyes. But she welcomed the discomfort. It was easier to focus on physical pain than the raw wound in her heart. Behind her lay Millbrook, the small Missouri town where she'd spent all 23 years of her life, where her brother Thomas still worked the forge their father had left him, where the church bells rang every Sunday, calling the faithful to worship, where she could never show her face again. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, though the chill she felt had little to do with the weather. The stagecoach driver had barely looked at her when she'd boarded in Independence, taking her fare with the same indifference he might show any traveler. He didn't know. Out here, she was just another woman heading west, not the fallen sister of Millbrook's respected blacksmith. The memories came unbidden, as they had every mile of this journey. Reverend Jonathan Mills, with his gentle voice and kind eyes, the way he'd spoken of Scripture as if the words were meant just for her. How foolish she'd been, letting herself believe his attention meant something more than Christian charity. His wife, Sarah, had been away, tending to her ailing mother, and Clara had begun helping with church correspondence. Such innocent beginnings for such a ruinous end. She pressed her fingers to her temples, willing the images away. The shocked faces of the church elders when Sarah Mills had returned unexpectedly, the Reverend's fumbling explanations, her own burning shame as she'd stood there, unable to deny what had passed between them. Not the ultimate sin, she had retained that much wisdom, but enough. The stolen moments, the whispered endearments, the kiss in the vestry that Sarah had witnessed. The town had been swift in its judgment. Jezebel. They'd called her temptress, home wrecker, as if she alone had the power to corrupt a man of God, as if Reverend Mills bore no responsibility for his own choices. He had been quietly transferred to another parish. She had been cast out. Thomas's face haunted her most. Her brother, 8 years her senior, who had raised her after their parents died of fever, who had taught her to read and write, who had saved every penny to buy her proper dresses. The disgust in his eyes when he'd told her to leave had cut deeper than any gossip. "I've got no sister," he'd said, turning back to his anvil. "Whatever you are, you're no kin of mine." The stagecoach lurched over a particularly deep rut, jolting Clara from her reverie. Through the dust-caked window, she could see the landscape changing. The gentle hills of Missouri had given way to vast prairies, then to this harsh country of red rock and sparse vegetation. Wyoming territory, the driver had announced at their last stop. The end of the line was Clay Ridge, still 2 days ahead. Clara had chosen Clay Ridge for one reason. She knew no one there, and no one would know her. It was a cattle town, the ticket agent had told her. Small but growing. There would be work for a woman who could read and write and keep accounts. A place to disappear, to perhaps become someone new. The other passengers, a weathered rancher and his young son, had disembarked at Fort Laramie, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts and the relentless rocking of the coach. She tried to sleep but found no peace. Instead, she pulled out the letter that had decided her fate, though she knew its contents by heart. It was from Martha Greenwood, a distant cousin of her mother's who had married and moved west years ago. Clara had written to her in desperation, and Martha had responded with unexpected kindness. She couldn't offer Clara a home. Her own circumstances were too modest, but she served as housekeeper for the local church and knew the town's needs. "There is work here for those willing to take it." Martha had written, "The past need not follow you beyond the mountains." As the sun began its descent, painting the barren landscape in shades of copper and gold, the stagecoach rolled into a way station. Clara climbed down stiffly, her muscles protesting after hours of confinement. The station was little more than a log building and a corral, but it promised a hot meal and a bed. The station keeper's wife, a stout woman with graying hair, looked Clara over with sharp eyes. "Traveling alone, miss?" "Yes, ma'am." Clara kept her voice steady. "To Clay Ridge." The woman's expression softened slightly. Family there? Work, Clara said simply. It wasn't quite a lie. Over a supper of beans and cornbread. Clara listened to the station keeper and his wife discuss the latest news. Drought in the southern counties. Trouble with rustlers near Cheyenne. The big ranches around Clay Ridge hiring for the winter. The Callahan spread's the largest, the station keeper said, sopping up bean juice with his bread. Though Silas Callahan's been keeping to himself since his wife passed, near 2 years now. His wife shot him a warning look. That's not fit conversation for supper. Clara kept her eyes on her plate, but she filed the information away. Large ranches meant civilization, employment, opportunity to blend in. She needed to know the landscape she was entering, social as well as physical. That night, lying on a narrow cot in the women's quarters, Clara stared at the rough-hewn ceiling and tried to imagine her new life. She would be respectable, careful. She would work hard and keep to herself. No more foolish dreams. No more letting her heart overrule her head. She had learned the price of that, and it had cost her everything. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Clara washed her face and hands in the basin, pinned her hair severely back, and donned her most modest dress. In the small mirror, she barely recognized herself. Good. Let Clara Elwood, the blacksmith's disgraced sister, fade away. She would become someone else, someone better. The final day's journey tested her resolve. The terrain grew increasingly desolate, with towering rock formations and endless stretches of sagebrush. The wind picked up, whistling through the coach's gaps and bringing the scent of distant snow. Clara had never felt so alone, so far from everything familiar, but with each mile, she also felt something else, a loosening of the tight bands around her chest. Out here, the sky was bigger than any shame. The mountains didn't care about her past. There was a terrible freedom in having lost everything. It meant she had nothing left to lose. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the driver called out, "Clay Ridge ahead." Clara pressed her face to the window. The town materialized out of the prairie like something from a storybook. False-fronted buildings lined a wide, dusty main street. She could see a general store, a hotel, what looked like a saloon. Beyond the town, the land rolled away in all directions, dotted with distant buildings that must be the ranches. The stagecoach pulled up in front of the hotel with a final lurch. Clara gathered her courage along with her carpetbag and stepped down into her new life. The street was busy with the commerce of a cattle town, cowboys driving a small herd through, wagons loaded with supplies, women in calico hurrying about their errands. No one looked twice at her. She was just another arrival, anonymous in the bustle. The relief of it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Miss Elwood." Clara turned to find a small woman in a gray dress and white apron approaching. Martha Greenwood looked older than Clara had imagined, her face weathered by sun and wind, but her smile was warm. "Cousin Martha?" Clara's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Just Martha will do," the woman said, taking Clara's bag with surprising strength. "Come, you look dead on your feet. Let's get you settled." As Martha led her through the town, chattering about the weather and the upcoming church social, Clara felt the first tentative hope she'd experienced in weeks. She had made it. She was here, in this place where no one knew her shame, where she could start again. They turned down a side street, and Martha pointed to a small clapboard church. "That's where I work. Reverend Foster is a good man, though his sermons do run long." She glanced at Clara with understanding eyes. "When you're ready, there might be work there, but I've heard tell that the Callahan Ranch is looking for someone who can handle accounts. Mr. Callahan's been managing alone since, well, for some time now." Clara nodded, filing away this second mention of the mysterious rancher. Tomorrow she would begin looking for work, would start building her new life. But tonight, she would rest. Martha led her to a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking the street. Clara set down her bag and turned to Martha. "Thank you," she said, meaning more than just the welcome. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Martha patted her hand. We all need a fresh start sometime. Child, just make the most of yours. After Martha left, Clara unpacked her few possessions. Her mother's Bible, 3 dresses, carefully mended, a small daguerreotype of her parents. Nothing from Thomas, nothing from her old life except what couldn't be left behind. The memories, the shame, the hard-won wisdom. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked out at the unfamiliar street. Somewhere in this town was her future, a chance to prove she was more than her worst moment, more than the names they'd called her. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Clara Elizabeth Elwood, sister of no one, watched the light fade over Clay Ridge and made herself a promise. She would survive this. She would build a life of quiet dignity, and she would never again let her heart lead her into ruin. Tomorrow would be the first day of her new existence. Tonight, for the first time in weeks, she slept without dreams. The morning sun crept through the thin curtains of the boarding house. Finding Clara already awake and dressed, she had slept fitfully, her dreams filled with endless prairies and the sound of wagon wheels. Now, standing before the small mirror, she pinned her hair into a severe bun and smoothed her plain gray dress. Today she would find work. Today she would begin earning her place in this rough frontier town. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house proprietor, had set out a simple breakfast of porridge and coffee. Clara ate mechanically, listening to the other boarders discuss the price of cattle and the weather prospects. No one paid her any attention beyond a polite nod. The anonymity was a blessing she savored with each spoonful. Martha Greenwood arrived as Clara was finishing her coffee. "Ready to see about that position?" she asked, her weathered face kind. "Mister, Callahan doesn't come to town often, but word is he'll be at the bank this morning. Best chance to speak with him directly." Clara's stomach tightened. She had never applied for such a position before. In Millbrook, she had helped Thomas with his accounts, but that had been family, informal. This would be different. This would be proving herself to a stranger, selling her skills like goods at market. The 2 women walked through Clay Ridge's dusty streets, Martha pointing out the important establishments. "That's Doc Harrison's office. Good man to know. The mercantile there is run by the Olson family. Fair prices. And stay clear of the Silver Dollar Saloon unless you're looking for trouble." The bank sat at the corner of Main and 2nd, a solid brick building that spoke of permanence and prosperity. Martha squeezed Clara's hand. "I'll wait at the mercantile. You'll do fine, child." Clara entered the bank, her heart hammering. The interior was cool and dim, smelling of leather and tobacco. A clerk looked up from his ledger. "Help you, miss?" "I understand, mister. Callahan might be here," Clara said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I hope to speak with him about the bookkeeping position at his ranch." The clerk's eyebrows rose slightly. "He's with Mr. Daniels in the back. You can wait." Clara sat on a hard wooden bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Through the window, she watched the life of the town pass by. Cowboys herding horses, a freight wagon rumbling past, women with baskets doing their marketing. It seemed impossible that she was here, so far from everything she'd known. The door to the back office opened, and Clara's first sight of Silas Callahan made her catch her breath. He was tall, perhaps 35, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that might have been handsome, if not for the hard lines etched around his mouth and eyes. He wore the practical clothing of a working rancher, but carried himself with an authority that marked him as a man of substance. His gaze found her, and she saw him take in her modest appearance with a quick, assessing look. "You're here about the position?" His voice was low, roughened by wind and sun. Clara stood, forcing herself to meet his eyes. They were gray, like winter sky. "Yes, sir. I'm Clara Elwood. I have experience with accounts and correspondence." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he could see through her careful respectability to the desperate woman beneath. "Can you ride?" The question surprised her. "A little, sir." The ranch is 15 miles out. You'd live there, separate quarters, room, board, and wages. Work includes keeping the books, managing household accounts, basic correspondence, sometimes helping Cookie with meals when we're short-handed. He paused. It's isolated. Town's a half-day's ride. Clara understood what he wasn't saying. A young woman, alone on a ranch with men. The impropriety of it. But she had left propriety behind in Missouri. That sounds suitable, Mr. Callahan. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she hadn't been put off. Can you start tomorrow? I'll send someone with a wagon. Yes, sir, thank you. He nodded curtly and strode out, leaving Clara slightly breathless. She had done it. She had secured employment, a place to live, a new beginning. The relief was so intense she had to sit back down on the bench. That evening, Martha helped her prepare. The Callahan ranch is well run, she said, folding Clara's few dresses into her carpet bag. Silas is a hard man, but fair, keeps to himself mostly, especially since... She stopped herself. Since his wife died? Clara ventured. Martha nodded. Margaret was a lovely woman. Her passing hit him hard. Some say he's never recovered. She gave Clara a meaningful look. You understand what I'm telling you? He's not a man looking for comfort. Best to keep things strictly business. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. I assure you, I have no intentions beyond earning my wages. Good. Martha's expression softened. I don't mean to sound harsh, child, but a young woman in your position must be twice as careful as others. The next morning, a weathered cowhand named Jake arrived with a wagon. He helped load Clara's meager possessions without comment, though she caught him stealing curious glances. As they left town behind, Clara tried to calm her nerves by focusing on the landscape. The road wound through sagebrush and scrub pine, climbing gradually into the foothills. The sky stretched endlessly, a blue so pure it hurt to look at. Been with Mr. Callahan long? She ventured after miles of silence. 10 years, give or take. Jake spit tobacco juice over the side. He's a good boss, expects hard work, gives fair pay, keeps his distance, though. Weren't always that way. Clara didn't press for more, sensing the loyalty beneath the cowhand's taciturn manner. As the hours passed, she began to understand the isolation Callahan had spoken of. They passed no other travelers, no homesteads, just endless space beneath the vast sky. The ranch, when it finally came into view, took her breath away. The main house sat on a rise, a 2-story structure of logs and stone that seemed to have grown from the land itself. Barns and corrals spread below, and in the distance, she could see cattle dotting the grasslands like scattered pepper. Big operation, Jake said with evident pride. 3,000 head. Last count, Mr. Callahan built most of it himself, him and his brother before Sam went to California. As they pulled up to the house, Clara saw a small cabin set apart from the other buildings. That's yours, Jake said, following her gaze. Margaret, Mrs. Callahan, used it for a sewing room. It's been closed up since... He didn't finish, but Clara understood. She was inheriting a dead woman's space. The thought should have been morbid, but instead, she felt a strange kinship with the unknown Margaret, another woman trying to make a life in this harsh land. Silas Callahan emerged from the main house as Jake was unloading her bags. In the daylight, Clara could see him more clearly, the premature silver threading through his dark hair, the way he held himself apart even while giving orders. Jake will show you around, he said without preamble. Cookie serves meals at 6, noon, and 6. You'll take yours in the kitchen unless invited otherwise. I'll go over the books with you after supper. Clara nodded, understanding the boundaries being set. She was help, not family. The distinction suited her perfectly. The cabin was small but clean, with a bed, washstand, small stove, and a table that could serve as a desk. The windows looked out over the vast grasslands, and Clara felt something unknot in her chest. Here, she could breathe. Here, she could hide. She unpacked quickly and reported to the main house kitchen, where Cookie, a grizzled man of indeterminate age, put her to work peeling potatoes. "Can always use another pair of hands," he said, though his tone suggested he'd reserved judgment on her usefulness. The kitchen was warm and filled with good smells. Clara found comfort in the simple task, the rhythm of the knife, the pile of white potatoes growing in the bowl. Through the window, she could see ranch hands going about their work, could hear the low of cattle and the whinny of horses. It was a working world, honest and uncomplicated. At noon, the hands filed in for dinner. Clara helped Cookie serve, keeping her eyes down, aware of the curious glances. She was a novelty, a young woman where there had been none, but the men were respectful, taking their plates with muttered thanks and focusing on their food. Silas ate in the dining room, alone. Clara caught glimpses of him through the doorway. His attention on papers spread before him even as he ate. A man of business, even at meals. The afternoon passed in a blur of chores. Cookie set her to making bread, pleased to find she knew her way around a kitchen. "Mrs. Callahan used to make the lightest biscuits," he said, then caught himself. Well, that was before. As the sun began its descent, painting the grasslands gold, Clara washed her hands and smoothed her hair. Time to prove her worth with the account books. She found Silas in what was clearly his study, a masculine room of dark wood and leather-bound ledgers. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. For the next hour, he explained his system, cattle purchases and sales, supply orders, payroll for the hands. His writing was neat but cramped, and Clara could see where the books had fallen behind. "I can bring these current," she said, running her finger down a column of figures, "and perhaps implement a clearer system for tracking expenses by category." He leaned back, studying her. "You've done this before." "My father was in business," she said, the lie coming smoothly. "I helped with his accounts." If he noticed her hesitation, he didn't comment. "Fine. The work is yours. I need monthly reports, and the correspondence kept current. Some of the other ranchers' wives used to handle social invitations, but," he stopped abruptly, "I can manage business correspondence only," Clara said quietly. "Good." He stood, clearly dismissing her. "One more thing. Miss Elwood, the hands are good men, but they're men. You have any trouble, you come to me or Jake. Understood?" "Yes, Mr. Callahan." She left the study feeling oddly unsettled. There had been something in his eyes when he'd mentioned trouble. Protective, almost. But she pushed the thought away. She was here to work, nothing more. That night, in her small cabin, Clara sat at the table and opened her mother's Bible. But instead of reading, she found herself staring out the window at the star-filled sky. In Millbrook, the stars had seemed small, hemmed in by trees and buildings. Here, they blazed like scattered diamonds, infinite and wild. She thought of Thomas, wondered if he ever regretted his harsh words, thought of Reverend Mills and his weakness, thought of all the choices that had led her to this moment, in this cabin, on this ranch at the edge of the world. Tomorrow she would rise and work. She would prove herself useful, indispensable even. She would build a life of quiet dignity, just as she'd promised herself. And if sometimes she caught her employer looking at her with those winter gray eyes, if sometimes she felt a flutter of something dangerous in her chest, well, she would ignore it. Clara Elwood had learned her lesson about wanting things she couldn't have. She wouldn't make the same mistake twice. The week settled into a rhythm at the Callahan Ranch. Clara rose with the sun, worked through the day, and retired to her cabin as darkness fell. She had brought order to the chaotic ledgers, implemented a filing system for correspondence, and even helped Cookie streamline his supply orders. The men had grown accustomed to her presence, treating her with a distant respect that suited her perfectly. It was on a trip to town for supplies that the careful walls she'd built began to crack. Cookie had taken ill with a stomach complaint, and Silas had reluctantly agreed to let Clara accompany Jake to Clay Ridge for the monthly provisions. She had dressed carefully, wearing her most modest bonnet and keeping her eyes downcast as they entered the mercantile. "Clara? Clara Elwood?" The voice made her blood freeze. She turned slowly to find herself face to face with Mrs. Adelaide Morrison, a woman who had lived 2 towns over from Millbrook, a woman who would know exactly who Clara was and what she had done. "I'm afraid you're mistaken," Clara said quietly, but the recognition in Adelaide's eyes was unmistakable. "No, I'm quite certain. You're Thomas Elwood's sister. I heard about, well..." Adelaide's voice carried just enough to draw attention from other shoppers. "What brings you to Clayridge?" "I work here," Clara said, lifting her chin despite the trembling in her stomach. "If you'll excuse me, I have purchases to make." But Adelaide wasn't finished. She followed Clara through the store, her voice a constant, piercing whisper. "Does your employer know? About your history? It seems only Christian to warn." "That's enough." Jake had appeared at Clara's elbow, his weathered face stern. "Miss Elwood, we best be getting back. Mr. Callahan's waiting on these supplies." Adelaide's eyes widened. "Callahan? You're working for Silas Callahan? Alone on that ranch?" Her implication was clear, and Clara felt her cheeks burn. "Good day, ma'am," Jake said firmly, steering Clara toward the door. They loaded the wagon in silence, but Clara could feel the questions radiating from the old cowhand. As they left town, she finally spoke. "I suppose you'll be telling Mr. Callahan." Jake spit tobacco juice and considered. "Tell him what? That some busybody was flapping her gums? Seen plenty of that in my years." Clara's eyes stung with unexpected tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Mr. Callahan judges folks by their work." Jake said gruffly, "You've been doing good work. That's all that matters to him, and to me." But Adelaide Morrison's appearance had shattered Clara's illusion of safety. Over the following days, she found herself jumping at shadows, waiting for the moment when her past would finally catch up with her. She threw herself into her work with renewed determination, as if perfect ledgers could somehow protect her from exposure. Silas noticed her distraction. He had taken to checking her work in the evenings, their meetings growing longer as they discussed ranch business. Clara had come to treasure these hours, the quiet companionship of shared purpose. Now she could barely meet his eyes. "You're troubled," he said one evening, setting down his pen. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine, Mr. Callahan. Shall we review the feed orders?" He studied her with those penetrating gray eyes. Jake mentioned an incident in town. Clara's hand stilled on the ledger. "It was nothing." "A woman who upset you, who questioned your presence here." She forced herself to look at him. "There will always be those who question a woman working in such a position. I'm prepared for that." "Are you?" His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Miss Elwood, when I hired you, I didn't ask about your past. Everyone who comes west is running from something or towards something. Sometimes both. Your history is your own business, so long as it doesn't affect your work here." The kindness undid her. She felt tears threaten and blinked them back furiously. "It won't, sir. I promise you that." He nodded slowly, but didn't return to the ledgers. Instead, he rose and moved to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. "My wife loved this view," he said unexpectedly. "Said she could see all the way to tomorrow from here." Clara remained silent, sensing the rarity of this confidence. She was delicate, he continued. "A town girl, not made for ranch life, but she tried. Lord, how she tried." His voice roughened. "The isolation wore on her, the loneliness. I was gone so much, building the herd, making contracts. I thought I was building our future. Turns out I was just gone." "I'm sorry," Clara said softly. He turned back to her, and she was startled by the raw pain in his eyes. "When she died, they said it was pneumonia, but I knew better. She'd been fragile for months, talking strangely, seeing things." He paused. "I should have taken her to town, to the doctor, should have seen what was happening. Instead, I buried myself in work and told myself she'd adjust." Clara understood then why he lived with such isolation, such rigid control. He was punishing himself. "We all have regrets, Mr. Callahan," she said carefully. Things we would change if we could, but the past is fixed. We can only try to do better moving forward. Something shifted in his expression. Wise words, Miss Elwood. Perhaps we both need to remember them. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken understanding. Then Silas cleared his throat and returned to his desk. The feed orders. Yes, let's review those. But something had changed. Over the following weeks, their evening meetings grew less formal. Silas began sharing stories of the ranch's early days, of his brother Sam who'd gone to seek gold in California. Clara found herself laughing at his dry observations, offering her own thoughts on ranch improvements. One evening, a fierce summer storm rolled in, turning the sky green-black and sending the cattle into nervous lowing. Clara had been in the main house, finishing the monthly accounts, when the first crack of lightning split the sky. "You can't walk back in this," Silas said as rain began hammering the roof. "Wait it out here." They sat in his study, watching the storm rage outside. The lamplight made a warm circle around them, holding back the wild darkness. Clara was acutely aware of his presence, the way his shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms, the way his hair fell across his forehead as he read. "You're staring," he said without looking up. Heat flooded her cheeks. "I apologize. I was just thinking." Dangerous occupation, but there was a slight smile playing at his lips. The wind howled louder, and suddenly the window burst open, sending papers flying. They both jumped up, Clara grabbing documents while Silas fought to close the window against the gale. For a moment, they collided. Clara's hands full of scattered papers, Silas's arm around her waist to steady her. They froze, suddenly aware of their proximity. Clara could feel the heat of him through her dress, could see the pulse beating in his throat. His eyes had darkened to charcoal, and his hand tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist. "Clara," he said, her given name rough on his lips. She knew she should step away, knew this was exactly the kind of moment that had ruined her before, but she couldn't move. Caught in the intensity of his gaze, it was Silas who broke away first, stepping back as if burned. "Forgive me," he said stiffly. "That was inappropriate." "No," Clara said, surprising herself. "That was human." He ran a hand through his hair, discomposing it further. "The storm's passing. Jake can drive you back." It was a dismissal, and Clara felt the sting of it. She gathered her dignity along with her shawl. "Of course. Good night, Mr. Callahan." But as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Clara." She turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. "Thank you for tonight, for listening." She nodded, not trusting her voice, and fled into the cooling night. The next morning brought a new crisis. Adelaide Morrison had not been idle. A letter arrived from the Cattlemen's Association, requesting Silas's presence at an emergency meeting. The tone was formal, but Clara could read between the lines. Her reputation was being discussed. She took the letter to Silas immediately, her hand steady despite her racing heart. He read it in silence, his face growing stonier with each line. "Pack your things," he said finally. The words hit her like a physical blow. "I understand," she managed through numb lips. "I'll be gone for town," he interrupted, looking up with surprise. "Pack your things for town. We're both attending this meeting. But they're questioning my character. My presence will only—" "They're questioning my judgment," Silas corrected. "And I'll be damned if I let a bunch of gossips dictate who I employ." He stood, and Clara was reminded of how imposing he could be when roused. "You'll wear your best dress. We'll take the good buggy, and we'll face them together. Mr. Callahan, you don't have to—" "Yes," he said firmly. "I do. Be ready in an hour." Clara returned to her cabin in a daze. He was defending her, publicly, knowing it could damage his own standing. She pressed her hands to her burning cheeks, trying to calm the wild hope blooming in her chest. This was gratitude. Nothing more. Loyalty to a good employee. It had to be. She dressed carefully in her Sunday dress, A deep blue that Martha had said brought out her eyes. Her hands shook as she pinned up her hair, but her resolve was firm. Whatever happened in town, she would face it with dignity. She owed Silas that much. He was waiting with the buggy, dressed in his town clothes, a black coat that emphasized his broad shoulders, a string tie at his throat. He helped her up without comment, his hand warm and steady on hers. The ride to town was silent, but it was a comfortable silence. Clara was aware of every inch of space between them on the narrow seat, of the way his hands held the reins with easy competence. The familiar landscape rolled by, but everything felt different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. As they entered Clay Ridge, Clara could see curious faces in windows, people stopping on the street to stare. News traveled fast in a small town. By now, everyone would know about Adelaide Morrison's accusations, about the Scarlet Woman working alone with the widowed rancher. Silas pulled up at the Cattlemen's Association building, a modest structure that served as the heart of the region's beef industry. He came around to help her down, and surprised her by offering his arm. "Chin up," he murmured. "Show them what you're made of." Clara placed her hand on his arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. Together, they walked into the building, ready to face whatever judgment awaited. The path to redemption, Clara was learning, was never smooth, but perhaps, just perhaps, she didn't have to walk it alone. The Cattlemen's Association meeting room fell silent as Silas and Clara entered. A dozen ranchers and their wives turned to stare, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. Adelaide Morrison sat near the front, her expression triumphant. "Callahan," said Robert Daniels, the association president and bank owner, "good of you to come." "Didn't realize I had a choice," Silas replied coolly, guiding Clara to a seat before taking his own. "Now, what's this about?" Daniels cleared his throat uncomfortably. "There have been concerns raised about the propriety of your current domestic arrangements." "My bookkeeper, you mean?" Silas's voice could have cut glass. "The one who's brought my accounts current for the first time in 2 years. A young, unmarried woman," Adelaide interjected, "living alone on your property, and not just any woman." "Mrs. Morrison," Silas interrupted, his tone deadly quiet. "I'd advise you to think very carefully before you finish that sentence." The room rustled with tension. Clara kept her eyes fixed on her folded hands, though she could feel the weight of every gaze. "The association has a reputation to maintain," Daniels continued diplomatically. "Our wives are concerned about the example being set." "What example?" Silas leaned back in his chair. "That a man can hire qualified help regardless of their gender. That people deserve a chance to make an honest living." "We know about Millbrook," Adelaide burst out. "About the minister and the scandal. She's a woman who made a mistake," Silas said, rising to his feet. "Unless there's someone in this room who claims perfection." His gaze swept the assembly. "No? Then perhaps we should focus on what matters. She does excellent work, causes no trouble, and deserves to be judged on her actions here, not rumors from elsewhere." Clara's throat tightened. She hadn't expected such fierce defense, such public support. Around the room, she saw some faces softening, others remaining stern. "Silas," said Henry Watson, an older rancher who'd been friends with Silas's father, "no one questions your judgment in business matters. But think of the talk, your own reputation. My reputation can stand on its own merits." Silas replied, "As can Miss Elwood's, given the chance." The meeting continued for another hour. Voices raised in argument. "Finally," Daniels called for order. "The association has no actual authority over individual hiring practices," he admitted reluctantly. "But Silas, we urge you to consider the implications." "Noted," Silas said curtly. "Are we finished here?" As they rose to leave, Clara felt a hand on her arm. She turned to find Mrs. Watson, Henry's wife, looking at her with kind eyes. "My dear," the older woman said quietly, "we all have pasts. Some of us are just luckier in keeping them buried. Hold your head high." The unexpected kindness nearly undid Clara's composure. She managed a whispered thank you before Silas guided her outside. They drove out of town in tense silence. Clara could feel Silas's anger radiating from him like heat from a stove. As the buildings gave way to open country, she finally spoke. "You shouldn't have defended me so strongly. It will cost you." He pulled the buggy to an abrupt stop, turning to face her. "Do you think I care what those hypocrites think?" "You should care. This ranch, your business, will survive just fine." His gray eyes blazed. "Clara, I've spent 2 years as the poor widower, pitied and whispered about. I've kept to myself, minded my business, been exactly what they expected. And for what? So they can dictate my choices. But your wife, my wife is dead." The words came out harsh. "Broken. And no amount of respectability will bring her back. I won't live my life by their rules anymore." They stared at each other, the air between them electric. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. "Silas," she breathed, using his given name for the first time. Something snapped. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face with desperate gentleness. "Tell me to stop," he said roughly. "Tell me this is wrong." But Clara couldn't speak, couldn't think beyond the feel of his calloused palms against her skin. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed. The kiss was everything she'd forgotten, heat and need and a tenderness that made her ache. His mouth moved against hers with a hunger that matched her own. 2 years of loneliness and grief pouring into this single moment of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Silas rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face. "Clara," he said, her name a prayer and a curse. Reality crashed back. Clara pulled away, pressing trembling fingers to her lips. "We can't. This is exactly what they expected. I don't care what they expected." But Silas was already withdrawing, his walls rebuilding before her eyes. He took up the reins again, clicking the horses into motion. "Forgive me. I wasn't thinking clearly." They completed the journey in painful silence. When they reached the ranch, Clara fled to her cabin without a word, her thoughts in turmoil. She had done it again, let her heart overrule her sense, given in to forbidden desire, but this time felt different. This wasn't a naive girl's infatuation with a forbidden man. This was something deeper, more dangerous. She tried to lose herself in work, but her usual refuge failed her. Every figure in the ledger reminded her of Silas's voice explaining the accounts. Every view from the window showed the house where he was, so close and yet impossibly distant. As evening fell, she forced herself to go to the kitchen for supper. Cookie took one look at her face and wisely kept his comments to himself. She ate mechanically, aware of the empty chair where Silas usually sat. He didn't appear. Back in her cabin, Clara tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat at her small table, staring at the lamp flame. A knock at the door made her jump. It was Jake, looking uncomfortable. "Boss wants to see you in his study, miss." Clara's stomach dropped. This was it. He would dismiss her after all. She smoothed her dress and followed Jake to the main house, each step feeling like a walk to the gallows. Silas was standing by the window when she entered, his back to her. A whiskey glass sat untouched on his desk. "Close the door," he said without turning. Clara did as instructed, then stood uncertainly near the entrance. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, still facing the window. "My behavior today was inexcusable. I put you in an impossible position." "You defended me," Clara said softly. "That wasn't inexcusable." He turned then, and she was struck by how tired he looked. "I crossed a line. After everything you've been through, the last thing you need is another man taking liberties." "Stop." The word came out sharper than she intended. "Don't you dare compare yourself to him." His eyes widened at her vehemence. Clara took a shaky breath. "What happened in Millbrook? I was young, foolish. I believed pretty words from a man who saw me as convenient." "A distraction." She forced herself to meet his gaze. "You're nothing like him. Silas, nothing. How can you be sure?" "Because you see me." The words tumbled out. Truth she hadn't meant to speak. Not as a fallen woman or a scandal, but as myself. Because you defended me when it cost you. Because you stopped when you thought I didn't want. Her voice broke. Clara. He moved toward her, then caught himself. What are you saying? She should leave, should protect them both from this dangerous path. Instead, she took a step closer. I'm saying that I'm tired of running from my heart, tired of being ashamed, tired of letting others dictate what I deserve. You deserve better than a broken-down rancher with more ghosts than sense. And you deserve better than a ruined woman with a scandalous past. They stood facing each other, the space between them charged with possibility. Where does that leave us? Silas asked quietly. Clara gathered her courage. Perhaps we deserve each other. He crossed the remaining distance in 2 strides, but this time when he took her in his arms, it was gentle, questioning. Are you certain? Instead of answering, Clara reached up and pulled his head down to hers. This kiss was different from the desperate passion in the buggy, slower, deeper, a claiming and a promise all at once. When his arms tightened around her, she melted into him, feeling safe for the first time since leaving Millbrook. They moved together to the small sofa by the fireplace, sinking down without breaking contact. Silas's hands tangled in her hair, pins scattering across the floor. Clara traced the strong lines of his face, marveling at the freedom to touch him. I've wanted this, he murmured against her throat. Watched you bringing life back to this place, this house. Wanted you, but thought I had no right. You have every right, Clara whispered. If you want it, if you want me. He pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes dark with emotion. Want you, Clara? You've haunted my days and invaded my dreams, but I need you to be sure. The town will talk. Your reputation is already ruined. She finished. Let them talk. I'm done living for their approval. They came together again, passion building like a prairie fire. But even as Clara lost herself in his touch, a small voice warned that morning would come, bringing consequences and complications. For now, though, she pushed those thoughts aside. For now, there was only this, Silas's mouth on hers, his hands gentle but eager, the feeling of being desired and cherished by a man who knew her secrets and wanted her anyway. When they finally drew apart, both breathless and disheveled, Silas stood abruptly. You should go, he said, though his voice suggested it was the last thing he wanted. Clara rose on unsteady legs, understanding. They had already crossed lines tonight, to cross the final one. Tomorrow? She asked. Tomorrow, he agreed. We'll talk, figure out what this means. But as Clara walked back to her cabin under the star-filled sky, she knew what it meant. It meant she had fallen in love with a man she couldn't have, not properly, not respectably. It meant she had opened her heart again, despite all her promises to herself. The night wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, still feeling the imprint of Silas's touch. Whatever came next, she couldn't regret tonight. For the first time in months, she felt truly alive. In the morning, there would be decisions to make, but tonight, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, 2 broken people could build something whole together, even if the whole world stood against them. The morning after their encounter, Clara woke with a mixture of dread and anticipation. She dressed carefully, pinning her hair more severely than usual, as if propriety in appearance could somehow atone for the impropriety of her feelings. When she entered the kitchen for breakfast, Cookie gave her a knowing look but said nothing. Silas was absent from the morning meal, and Clara tried not to read meaning into his absence. She threw herself into her work, updating the ledgers with mechanical precision, but her mind kept wandering to the previous night, the feel of his arms, the intensity in his gray eyes. It was near noon when the sound of approaching horses drew her to the window. A lone rider was approaching, moving with the purposeful speed of someone bearing news. As he drew closer, Clara's heart sank. She recognized him. Matthew Harrison, eldest son of Millbrook's most prominent family, and more importantly, the elder brother of Samuel Harrison, who had once courted her before the scandal. She watched from her cabin as Matthew dismounted and was greeted by Silas. Their conversation appeared civil enough, but she could see the tension in Silas's shoulders. After several minutes, Silas turned toward her cabin, his face grim. Clara met him at the door, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Mr. Callahan, you need to hear this," he said without preamble. "Harrison, state your business to Miss Elwood." Matthew removed his hat, but his eyes were cold as they assessed her. "Miss Elwood, or should I say, the former Miss Elwood who brought such shame to our town. Say what you came to say." Silas growled. Matthew's jaw tightened. "Very well. Your father, Miss Elwood, left some debts when he died. Your brother Thomas has been managing them, but recently he's fallen ill. The forge isn't bringing in enough. As his largest creditor, I'm prepared to call in the full amount unless—" He paused meaningfully. "Unless what?" Clara asked, though she suspected she knew. "Unless you return to Millbrook and face what you've done. Make amends to those you've wronged, including Reverend Mills's widow. She deserves an apology for your part in destroying her marriage." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. "Reverend Mills is dead. 3 months ago. Heart failure, the doctor said, though many believe it was shame that killed him." Matthew's voice was pitiless. "His widow struggles to make ends meet, shunned by association with the scandal. Your brother's illness is seen by many as God's judgment for harboring you as long as he did. That's enough." Silas stepped forward. "How much?" Matthew named a sum that made Clara gasp. It was more than she could earn in 5 years. "I'll pay it," Silas said flatly. "No!" Clara grabbed his arm. "You can't. I won't let you—" "The debt must be paid by family," Matthew interrupted smoothly, "or by the person who caused the family's downfall. Miss Elwood must return with me, make her apologies publicly, and work to pay off what's owed. It's that, or I'll pursue legal action against her brother while he lies sick." Clara's mind raced. Thomas, ill and in debt because of her. Mrs. Mills, widowed and ostracized. The poison of her mistake spreading even after she'd fled. "I'll go," she heard herself say. "Clara, no." Silas turned to her, his face fierce. "This is extortion. This is justice." Matthew countered. "She ruined lives. There must be accountability." "I'll need time to arrange things," Clara said, her voice surprisingly steady. 3 days. Matthew nodded curtly. 3 days. Then I expect you ready to travel." He mounted his horse and rode off without another word. Clara stood frozen until Silas's hands on her shoulders brought her back. "You're not going. I have to. Thomas, I'll send money to your brother. I'll hire him help for the forge. And Mrs. Mills, can you undo her grief? Can you restore her reputation?" Clara pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself. "I did this, Silas. I was selfish and foolish, and others paid the price. Maybe it's time I faced that. You made a mistake. That doesn't mean you deserve to be paraded through town like a criminal. Doesn't it?" The tears she'd been holding back spilled over. "I thought I could run from it, start fresh. But the past always finds you." Silas caught her hands. "Not if you don't let it. Clara, please, we'll find another way." She looked up at him, memorizing his face. "Last night. I'm glad we had that, but perhaps it's better this way. You can find someone worthy of you, someone who won't bring scandal to your door. Don't," his voice was rough, "don't you dare decide what's best for me. Someone has to," she whispered. "You won't do it for yourself." She pulled free and walked back to her cabin, closing the door on his protests. Inside, she sank onto her bed, shaking. The brief happiness she'd allowed herself had been just that, brief, an illusion. She had debts to pay, in more than just money. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Clara mechanically completed her tasks, her mind already in Millbrook, imagining the faces she would confront. Would Thomas even want to see her? Would Mrs. Mills accept her apology, or would it only deepen her pain? As evening approached, She began packing her few belongings. The knock at her door wasn't unexpected. She'd known Silas wouldn't let this go easily, but it wasn't Silas. Cookie stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Boss wants you to take supper in the dining room. Says it's business." Clara wanted to refuse, but she owed Silas the courtesy of a proper goodbye. She followed Cookie to the main house, steeling herself. The dining room was softly lit, the table set for two. Silas stood by the window, dressed in his good white shirt. He turned as she entered, and the look in his eyes made her heart stutter. "Sit," he said gently. "Please." She took her place warily. Cookie served them in unusual silence. Roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread. It smelled wonderful, but Clara couldn't eat. "I've been thinking," Silas said finally, "about debts and payment and justice." Clara pushed food around her plate. "There's nothing to think about. I leave in 3 days. Or," he continued as if she hadn't spoken, "you could marry me." Her fork clattered to her plate. "What? Marry me?" He leaned forward, intense. "Harrison can't pursue a debt against my wife. More importantly, no one in Millbrook would dare slander Mrs. Silas Callahan. You could write to Mrs. Mills, send her money if you wish, but from a position of security, not shame. Silas, you can't—" "I buried one wife," he interrupted. "Watched her fade away while I did nothing. I won't watch you disappear too. Not when I can prevent it. This is different. I'm not Margaret." "No," he agreed. "You're not. You're stronger than she was. Strong enough to start over, to face down gossip, to build something from nothing. Strong enough to save me from becoming a ghost in my own life." Clara's eyes burned. "You don't need saving." "Don't I?" He stood, came around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Clara, I was dead inside until you arrived, going through motions, existing but not living. You brought light back into this house, laughter, hope. You're offering marriage out of pity. I'm offering marriage out of love." The words hung between them, stark and true. "I love you, Clara Elwood. Not despite your past, but because of who it's made you. I love your strength, your dignity, your refusal to be broken. I am broken," she whispered. "Then we'll be broken together." He took her hands. "Say yes. Let me protect you. Let me love you. Let us build something new from the pieces of our old lives." Clara looked into his eyes, saw the truth there. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering partnership. Not pity, but love. "The town will talk. Your business associates will adjust or find someone else to buy their cattle." His hands tightened on hers. "I'm done living for their approval. The only opinion that matters to me is yours." "Silas." She couldn't find the words. Instead, she slipped from her chair to kneel with him, cupping his face in her hands. "Are you certain? Truly certain?" "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "Then yes," she breathed. "Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, sweet and fierce and full of promise. When they finally drew apart, both were trembling. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll go to town tomorrow, get the license, marry by the end of the week, before Harrison returns." "So romantic," Clara laughed shakily. "Marrying to spite a debt collector." "We're marrying for love," Silas corrected. "The rest is just practical benefits." He helped her to her feet, then surprised her by pulling her close again. "Stay tonight." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Silas, we shouldn't—" "Just stay," he murmured against her hair. "I need to know you're real, that you won't vanish in the morning. We'll be married in days. Surely God will forgive us a little anticipation." Clara thought of all the rules she'd broken, all the judgment she'd faced. What was one more transgression, when it was born of love rather than foolish infatuation? "Yes," she whispered. He led her upstairs to his room, their room soon. It was masculine, sparse, but Clara could see touches of the woman who'd been there before. A silver brush on the dresser, curtains too delicate for a man's choice. "We'll change whatever you like," Silas said, following her gaze. "No," Clara said softly. "She was part of your life. That doesn't threaten me." He turned her to face him. wonder in his eyes. "How did I find you?" "Providence," Clara suggested. "Or perhaps we found each other." They came together slowly, savoring each touch, each revelation. When Silas laid her on the bed, his hands infinitely gentle, Clara felt the last of her walls crumble. This was nothing like that fumbling encounter with Reverend Mills. This was communion. Two souls recognizing their match. Later, wrapped in Silas's arms as moonlight painted silver squares on the floor. Clara allowed herself to believe in redemption. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Harrison's anger, the town's gossip, the long work of building a life together. But tonight, she was just a woman loved by a good man. Tonight, she was home. No regrets, Silas murmured against her hair. None, Clara said firmly. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. Together. He agreed, and Clara felt the words settle into her bones like a promise. Outside, a coyote called to its mate across the prairie. The sound that had once seemed lonely now spoke of connection, of finding one's match in the wilderness. Clara smiled and burrowed closer to Silas's warmth. She had run so far to escape her past, only to find her future in the most unexpected place. Tomorrow, she would become Clara Callahan. The scandal of Millbrook would become a distant memory, replaced by the reality of love, partnership, and the second chance she'd never dared hope for. The news of Silas Callahan's sudden marriage spread through Clay Ridge like wildfire. Clara had expected the gossip, the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the mercantile. What she hadn't expected was how little it bothered her with Silas's ring on her finger and his solid presence at her side. They had married quietly, with only Jake and Martha Greenwood as witnesses. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, and when Silas kissed his bride, Clara felt the last chains of her past fall away. She was no longer the fallen woman of Millbrook. She was Mrs. Silas Callahan, rancher's wife, with all the respectability that entailed. Matthew Harrison's reaction had been predictably furious. He'd arrived at the ranch 3 days after their wedding, demanding to see Clara, only to be met by Silas with their marriage certificate. "You think this changes anything?" Harrison had snarled. "She still owes—" "My wife owes nothing to anyone," Silas had replied coolly. "And if you continue to harass her, you'll answer to me. As for her brother's debts, I've sent payment in full to your bank. Our business is concluded." Harrison had left with threats of social ruin, but Silas had merely shrugged. "Let him talk. We have cattle to tend and a ranch to run." Now, a month into their marriage, Clara was learning the rhythms of her new life. She still kept the books and helped Cookie with meals, but she also stood beside Silas as his partner in all things. The ranch hands, initially skeptical, had warmed to her when they saw how she worked alongside them during a difficult calving season. It was during this time that the past rose up in an unexpected way. Clara was in the kitchen, kneading bread, when Cookie announced a visitor. Her hands stilled as Mrs. Sarah Mills entered, older, grayer, dressed in widow's weeds. "Mrs. Mills?" Clara breathed, flour-covered hands clutching her apron. The older woman studied her for a long moment. "Mrs. Callahan now. I hear—" "Please, sit." Clara's voice shook slightly. "Can I offer you tea?" Sarah Mills sat primly at the kitchen table while Clara prepared tea with trembling hands. The silence stretched between them, years of pain and regret filling the space. "I didn't come for apologies," Sarah said finally. "I came for understanding." Clara set the teacup before her carefully. "I don't know if I have any to offer. I was young and foolish. I thought he cared for me specially. I never meant—" "To destroy my marriage?" Sarah's voice was tired rather than bitter. "I know, just as Jonathan never meant to stray. But intentions matter little when the damage is done." "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered. "For all of it, for your loss." Sarah sipped her tea thoughtfully. "He was weak, my Jonathan. I knew that when I married him. Knew he needed constant reassurance, constant attention. When I left to tend Mother, I knew there was risk. You were just Convenient. The words stung, but Clara recognized their truth. Yes, I see that now. He spoke of you, near the end. Sarah's eyes were distant. Said he'd wronged you terribly, that the blame was his, not yours, that he'd let you bear the shame alone while he kept his position. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. He was a good man who made a mistake. We all make mistakes, Sarah said softly. The question is what we do after. She looked around the warm kitchen, taking in the signs of Clara's new life. You found happiness here? Yes, unexpected, but real. Good. Sarah stood. Then perhaps something positive came from all that pain. She paused at the door. I'll be moving to Denver, to live with my sister. I needed to see you before I left, to tell you that I don't hate you, that I forgive you, as I hope to be forgiven for my own failures. After she left, Clara stood in the kitchen, tears flowing freely. The absolution she hadn't known she needed had been freely given. When Silas found her there, he simply held her while she wept out the last of her guilt. She forgave me, Clara mumbled against his shirt. You forgave yourself first. Silas reminded her. That's what gave her the freedom to do the same. As summer gave way to autumn, the ranch faced new challenges. A group of smaller ranchers, led by Adelaide Morrison's husband, began making noise about Silas's water rights. The real issue, everyone knew, was Clara's presence as his wife. Some people couldn't bear to see happiness bloom where they'd predicted disaster. The conflict came to a head at the Autumn Cattlemen's Association meeting. This time, Clara attended as Silas's wife, her head high despite the cold reception from some quarters. When George Morrison stood to challenge their water claims, Silas was ready with surveys and legal documents, but it was Clara who delivered the killing blow. If we're discussing water rights, she said, rising gracefully, perhaps we should also discuss the Morrison cattle I've seen drinking from Callahan Creek without permission. I have the dates and counts in my ledger, if anyone would like to see them. The room erupted. Morrison blustered and threatened, but the evidence was clear in Clara's meticulous records. Other ranchers, impressed by her attention to detail and courage, began to nod approvingly. By the end of the meeting, the Morrisons found themselves isolated while the Callahans received several dinner invitations. My warrior wife, Silas murmured as they drove home. Remind me never to cross you. You couldn't. Clara replied, You're stuck with me now. Thank God for that. But the greatest test came with the winter blizzards. A fierce storm struck without warning, catching part of the herd in the open. Silas and the hands rode out into the white fury, leaving Clara to coordinate from the ranch house. Hours passed with no word. Clara kept coffee hot, gathered medical supplies, and tried not to think about losing Silas to the same unforgiving land that had shaped him. When riders finally appeared through the snow, she counted frantically. Jake, young Tom, the Rodriguez brothers, but no Silas. Where is he? She demanded, pulling on her coat. Went back for a calf, Jake said through blue lips. Stubborn fool wouldn't leave it. Without thinking, Clara grabbed a rope and headed for the barn. Jake tried to stop her. Ma'am, you can't. Watch me. She saddled her mare with hands that shook from more than cold. She'd learned to ride properly over the past months, Silas teaching her with patient humor. Now she put those lessons to use, heading into the storm with only instinct and desperation to guide her. The world was white and howling, all landmarks erased. Clara trusted her horse, knowing the mare's instincts were better than her own. When she finally spotted a dark shape against the snow, her heart nearly stopped. Silas was hunched over a calf, trying to shelter it with his own body. You magnificent fool, she shouted over the wind. He looked up, ice crusting his face. Clara, what are you... Saving you, apparently. She maneuvered close, threw him the rope. Tie the calf, we're getting out of here. Together they secured the calf to her saddle. Silas mounted behind her, his arms coming around her as he took the reins. Even half frozen, his presence made her feel safe. They made it back to find the ranch in an uproar, the hands ready to mount a search party for them both. Cookie fussed over them while Jake tended the calf, muttering about crazy ranchers and their crazier wives. Later, warm and dry in their bed, Silas held her close. "You could have died out there. So could you. I'm not worth. You are to me." She turned in his arms, fierce. "You're worth everything to me. Don't you know that by now?" He kissed her deeply, and Clara felt the truth of their bond. They were matched in stubbornness, in courage, in love. The prim minister's daughter who'd started this journey would never have ridden into a blizzard. But Silas's wife, she'd ride into hell itself for him. The winter passed with its share of hardships and small victories. Clara learned to help with calving, to read the weather in cloud formations, to tell the health of cattle at a glance. The ranch hands, who'd once eyed her skeptically, now came to her with their problems, trusting her discretion and good sense. Spring arrived with its usual promise of renewal. Clara stood on the porch of the main house, watching Silas work with a young horse in the corral. Her hand drifted to her still flat stomach, where new life grew, a secret she'd share with him tonight, when they were alone. "Admiring the view?" Martha Greenwood asked, joining her on the porch. She'd come for her weekly visit, one of many friends Clara had made in her new life. "Always," Clara admitted. "I never thought I'd be here. Martha, never thought I deserved this happiness." "Deserve's got nothing to do with it," Martha said wisely. "Grace isn't earned, child. It's given. You just had to be brave enough to accept it." Clara thought of the journey that had brought her here, the shame, the flight, the fear, all of it leading to this moment, this life, this love. She thought of Thomas, recovering now with the help Silas had sent, of Sarah Mills, finding peace in Denver, of herself, transformed from scandal to salvation. "Mrs. Callahan." One of the newer hands approached nervously. "Cookie's asking for you. Something about the menu for the spring gathering. I'll be right there," Clara called. She squeezed Martha's hand. "Thank you for everything." "Go on." Martha smiled. "You've got a life to live." Clara went, moving through her domain with confidence. She was Clara Callahan, wife, rancher, friend, and soon-to-be mother. The woman who'd fled Millbrook in disgrace had become someone she couldn't have imagined, someone worthy of the love and respect she'd found. As she entered the warm kitchen, she could hear Silas's voice through the window, talking to the horses in the low, gentle tone he used with all creatures in his care. Tonight she'd tell him about the baby. Tonight they'd planned for a future neither had dared dream of when they'd first met. The blacksmith's shamed sister had found more than refuge in the rancher's arms. She'd found redemption, purpose, and a love strong enough to weather any storm. In the wild heart of Wyoming, two broken souls had built something whole and beautiful, and this was only the beginning. The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth as Clara made her way to the small schoolhouse she'd helped establish at the edge of town. Her pregnancy was showing now, a gentle roundness beneath her simple cotton dress, but she refused to let it slow her down. There was too much work to be done. "Mrs. Callahan!" Young Beth Morrison ran up to her, braids flying. Despite her parents' initial hostility, the child had become one of Clara's most devoted students. "Did you bring the new readers?" "Of course." Clara smiled, patting her satchel. "And wait until you see the arithmetic primers, Mr. Callahan ordered from Denver." The schoolhouse had been her project, born from watching the ranch hands' children run wild without education. She'd started teaching them in her kitchen, but as word spread, more families brought their children. Now she had 12 students, ranging from 6 to 14 years old. As she entered the simple building, Clara felt the familiar pride. The rough boards and simple benches weren't much, but the eager faces of her students made it a palace. She'd fought hard for this, convincing the town council, many of whom still viewed her with suspicion, that education was essential for Clayridge's future. "Good morning, class," she called, and received a chorus of responses. As she began the day's lessons, Clara couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The woman who'd arrived in Clayridge seeking invisibility now stood at the heart of community life. After school, she stopped at Doc Harrison's office for her monthly examination. The elderly physician had become a trusted friend, one of the first to accept her without reservation. "Everything looks fine," he announced after his examination, "though I still think you should reduce your activities." "And I still think you worry too much," Clara replied, adjusting her dress. "I'm pregnant, not invalid. Has Silas had any luck finding help for the house?" Clara sighed. They'd been trying to hire a housekeeper for months, but most women were reluctant to work for the formerly scandalous Mrs. Callahan. "Not yet, but Cookie and I manage well enough." "You do too much," Doc Harrison said bluntly. "Teaching school, keeping the ranch books, helping with community projects." "Living," Clara interrupted gently. "I'm living, Doc, for the first time in my life. I'm truly living." As she drove the buggy back to the ranch, Clara noticed a dust cloud on the southern horizon. Visitors were unusual enough to be noteworthy. She urged the horses faster, arriving home to find Silas standing with a stranger on the porch. The man was travel-worn but well-dressed, with something familiar about the set of his shoulders. When he turned, Clara's heart stopped. Thomas, her brother, had come. She climbed down carefully, aware of Silas moving to support her. Thomas's eyes widened as he took in her obvious pregnancy, her comfortable clothes, her wedding ring. "Clara," he said, his voice rougher than she remembered. "Thomas." She was proud that her voice didn't shake. "You're recovered. Thanks to your husband's generosity." He twisted his hat in his hands. I came to thank him, and to—" He stopped, swallowed hard. "To see my sister, if she'll have me." Clara felt Silas's hand warm on her back, supporting without controlling. The choice was hers. She thought of the harsh words, the turned back, the denial of kinship. Then she thought of grace, freely given by Sarah Mills, by Silas, by this community that had eventually embraced her. "You'll stay for supper," she said simply. "Cookie's making pot roast." Thomas's shoulders sagged with relief. "I'd be grateful." The evening was awkward at first. Thomas clearly struggled with seeing his sister in her new life. Confident, respected, loved. But as talk turned to the ranch, to the challenges of blacksmithing in a growing town, the ice began to thaw. "You've done well," Thomas said finally, as Clara poured coffee in the parlor. "Better than I ever imagined." "No thanks to you," Silas said coolly. He'd been civil but distant all evening. "Silas," Clara warned softly. "No, he's right," Thomas said. "I failed you. Clara, when you needed me most, I turned you away. I let pride and shame override family duty." "You were angry," Clara said. "Disappointed. I was a coward." Thomas met her eyes squarely. "It was easier to cast you out than to face the gossip. Easier to play the righteous man than to stand by my sister." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "We all made mistakes, some more than others." Thomas pulled out an envelope. "I've been saving this, your portion of Father's legacy, plus interest. It's not much, but I don't want your money, Thomas." "Then take it for the baby." His voice cracked slightly. "Let me do something right by family for once." Clara looked at Silas, who nodded slightly. "Thank you," she said, accepting the envelope. Would you consider staying? Clayridge could use a good blacksmith." Thomas's eyes widened. "After everything?" "Because of everything," Clara corrected. "We've both learned what matters. Perhaps it's time to be family again." Thomas stayed for 3 days, helping with ranch work and slowly rebuilding the sibling bond that had been severed. When he left, it was with promises to consider relocating and an invitation to return for the baby's birth. "You've a generous heart," Silas told her that night. "I learned from the best," Clara replied, curling into his warmth. As autumn approached, bringing blessed relief from the summer heat, Clara threw herself into preparing for the annual Harvest Festival. It was Clayridge's biggest social event, and this year she was on the planning committee, a sure sign of her acceptance into respectable society. The work was exhausting but satisfying. She coordinated with the other committee members, even Adelaide Morrison, who had finally unbent enough to be civil. The festival would have contests, dancing, food booths, and a special auction to raise money for the school. "You're pushing too hard," Silas warned, finding her asleep over lists one evening. "The festival is next week." Clara protested. "There's still so much to do." "Delegate," he ordered. That's what committees are for. But Clara couldn't help herself. She wanted everything perfect, wanted to prove herself worthy of the town's trust. The old fears still surfaced sometimes, that people were watching, waiting for her to reveal her true, flawed nature. The day of the festival dawned clear and bright. Clara was at the fairgrounds before sunrise, directing booth setup and fielding last-minute crises. She barely noticed the twinges in her back, dismissing them as the result of too much activity. By noon, the festival was in full swing. Clara moved through the crowds, greeting neighbors, admiring contest entries, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Several people complimented her on the organization, and Mrs. Watson pulled her aside to say how proud she was of all Clara had accomplished. "You've become the heart of this town," the older woman said. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Clara was touched, but before she could respond, a sharp pain shot through her middle. She gasped, clutching the nearest table. "Clara?" Mrs. Watson's voice seemed to come from far away. "Dear, what's wrong?" "The baby." Clara managed. "It's too early. 2 months too early." The next hours blurred together, Silas appearing as if by magic, his face white with fear. The frantic ride to Doc Harrison's office, the pain that came in waves, stealing her breath and her certainty. "It's too soon," she kept saying. "Too soon." Doc Harrison worked with grim efficiency while Silas held her hand. Martha Greenwood appeared, offering comfort and prayers. The pain went on, until Clara thought she couldn't bear it. Then, suddenly, a thin cry pierced the air. Clara fell back, exhausted, as Doc Harrison worked over the tiny form. "A girl," he announced, "small but fighting." They placed the baby on Clara's chest, so tiny, so perfect, so fragile. Clara touched the miniature fingers, the downy hair, and felt love so fierce it took her breath away. "She's early," Doc Harrison said carefully. "The next days will be critical. Keep her warm, feed her often if she'll take it, and pray." They named her Margaret Hope Callahan. Margaret for the past they honored. Hope for the future they believed in. She was indeed a fighter, demanding food every 2 hours, her cries surprisingly strong for such a tiny body. The town rallied around them. Food appeared daily at the ranch. Women took turns sitting with Clara, sharing their own stories of difficult births and tiny babies who grew strong. Even Adelaide Morrison sent a beautifully knitted blanket. Thomas arrived within days of receiving Silas's telegram. He took one look at his tiny niece and wept openly. "She's beautiful," he said. "Like her mother. Stubborn like her mother, too," Silas added, exhausted from nights of walking the floor with the fussy baby. Slowly, Margaret grew. Each ounce gained was celebrated, each milestone, opening her eyes fully, gripping Silas's finger, managing to nurse for more than a few minutes, treated as a triumph. Clara barely left her side, terrified that if she looked away, this precious gift would vanish. "She's not going anywhere," Silas told her one night, finding her watching the baby sleep. "She's a Callahan. We're hard to kill." "I'm scared," Clara admitted. "I've been so blessed. You, this life. Now her. What if—" "No what ifs," Silas interrupted. "We take each day as it comes, each gift as it's given. That's all anyone can do." As winter approached, Margaret had grown round and healthy. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determined chin. The doctor declared her out of danger, though smaller than typical for her age. Clara resumed some of her activities, wearing the baby in a sling as she taught school or worked on the books. The sight of the formerly scandalous woman with a baby at her breast while conducting business became commonplace in Clay Ridge. Some called it unseemly. Others called it progress. "You've changed this town," Martha told her one afternoon, watching Clara simultaneously nurse Margaret and help young Beth with arithmetic. shown them a different way of being a woman. I've just been myself. Clara protested. Exactly. Martha smiled. And that self is pretty remarkable. As the first snow began to fall, Clara stood at her kitchen window, Margaret sleeping in her arms. Through the glass, she could see Silas working with the hands, preparing for winter, her husband, her partner, her love. She thought of the frightened woman who'd stepped off the stagecoach over a year ago, seeking invisibility and finding so much more. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared. It had transformed into wisdom, compassion, understanding. She'd learned to forgive others by first forgiving herself. Your mama was a fool once, she whispered to Margaret. But she learned, and you, my darling, will never have to run. You'll grow up strong and proud, knowing you're loved and wanted, knowing you belong. Margaret stirred, making the soft sounds that preceded waking. Soon she'd be demanding food, attention, everything an infant required. Clara smiled, pressing a kiss to the downy head. Let her demand, let her need. Clara had love enough to give, and a whole community ready to help. The blacksmith's shamed sister had become teacher, wife, mother, pillar of the community, not by hiding her past, but by transcending it. As Silas came in, stamping snow from his boots, Clara turned to greet him with a smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be many, they would face them together. A family forged not despite hardship, but because of how they'd chosen to meet it. "How are my girls?" Silas asked, kissing first Clara, then Margaret. "Perfect," Clara answered, meaning it with every fiber of her being. "Absolutely perfect." The drought began in late spring, when the rains that usually blessed the Wyoming grasslands failed to appear. At first, it seemed like merely a dry spell, concerning but manageable. Clara watched Silas scan the cloudless skies each morning. His jaw tightening with worry, he tried to hide. By midsummer, the situation had become dire. The grass turned brown and brittle. Streams ran low, and the cattle grew thin despite the ranch hands' best efforts to find grazing. Clara knew they weren't alone in their struggles. Every ranch in the region was suffering. "We need to sell off part of the herd," Silas announced one evening, spreading maps across his desk. "Take them to market before they lose more weight." Clara bounced Margaret on her knee while reviewing the accounts. At nearly 2 years old, their daughter had grown into a spirited child with her mother's determination and her father's steady gaze. "We can manage," Clara said, though the numbers told a harsh story. "If we're careful, sell the right cattle, conserve water, you always believe we can manage," Silas said with a tired smile. "Even when the odds are against us." "Especially then," Clara replied. "Remember what we've already survived? The cattle drive would take 2 weeks, to the railhead where buyers from Chicago waited. Silas would lead it personally, along with most of the hands. Clara would remain at the ranch with Cookie, Jake, and young Tom Morrison, who'd become their most reliable hand despite his parents' initial disapproval. The night before the drive, Clara found herself clinging to Silas longer than usual. "Come back safe," she whispered against his chest. "Always," he promised. "Take care of our girl. And yourself. We'll be fine. You just worry about getting those cattle to market." But after he left, leading the diminished herd into the dusty dawn, Clara felt unease settle in her bones. Maybe it was the unnatural stillness of the air, or the way the animals seemed restless, or maybe it was simply the instinct that comes from surviving hardship, the sense that more was coming. 3 days into Silas's absence, a wildfire sparked in the southern hills. Clara spotted the smoke while collecting eggs, a dark smudge against the morning sky that made her heart race. By noon, the wind had picked up, pushing the fire toward the ranch. "We need to create a fire break," Jake said grimly, assessing the situation. "Save what we can." Clara didn't hesitate. She strapped Margaret to her back and joined the desperate effort to clear a strip of land between the ranch and the advancing flames. They worked through the heat of the day. Clara, Cookie, Jake, and Tom, along with neighboring ranchers who'd seen the smoke and come to help. Her hands blistered from the shovel work, sweat stinging her eyes. But Clara didn't stop. This was their home, their life. She wouldn't let it burn without a fight. As night fell, the fire crested the hill like a living thing, orange and terrible against the darkness. The firebreak held, barely. Sparks flew over their heads, starting spot fires that they rushed to extinguish. Clara's skirts caught fire once, and Tom threw her to the ground, rolling her in dirt until the flames died. "You should get to town with the baby," Jake urged, his face blackened with soot. "I'm not leaving," Clara said firmly, checking that Margaret was still secure on her back. The child, remarkably, had fallen asleep despite the chaos. "This is our home. We defend it together." Through the night they fought, until Clara's world narrowed to the ache in her arms, the heat on her face, and the determination not to yield. When dawn finally came, revealing the fire had passed them by, she collapsed to her knees in exhaustion and relief. The ranch had survived, though barely. The southern pastures were black and destroyed, several outbuildings lost, but the house and main barn stood intact. As Clara surveyed the damage, she saw riders approaching, Silas and the hands, riding hard. "We saw the smoke from 20 miles out," Silas said, swinging down from his lathered horse. His eyes took in Clara's singed dress, her soot-streaked face, the blisters on her hands. "My God, Clara." "We saved it," she said simply, then swayed on her feet. He caught her, holding her and Margaret close. "Of course you did, my warrior wife." The cattle sale had gone well enough to keep them afloat, though prices were down due to the widespread drought. But as they rebuilt from the fire damage, other challenges emerged. Several families were leaving the area, unable to sustain the losses. The school Clara had worked so hard to establish was down to 5 students. "Maybe we should consider it too," Silas said one evening, watching Clara tend her burned hands. "California, Oregon, somewhere with reliable water." Clara looked up sharply. "Leave? After everything we built? What good is building if nature tears it down? Then we build again," Clara said fiercely. "Stronger, better. That's what we do. Silas, we don't run." He pulled her close. "When did you become the strong one?" "The day you gave me reason to be," she answered. Thomas arrived the following week, his forge wagon loaded with supplies. He'd finally made the move to Clay Ridge, partly to be near family, partly because even Millbrook was struggling with the drought. His presence was a comfort, another pair of strong hands for the rebuilding. "Heard you fought a fire while wearing a baby on your back," he said, shaking his head. "The sister I knew would have fainted at the thought." "That sister is gone," Clara replied. "This one does what needs doing." As autumn approached with still no rain, the community pulled together in ways Clara had never seen. Families shared water, pooled resources for feed, worked each other's land. The Sunday church services became as much about survival planning as salvation. It was during one such service that Clara noticed old Mrs. Henderson struggling with her young grandson. The boy's parents had died of fever the previous winter, leaving the elderly woman to raise him alone. After the service, Clara approached her. "Let me help," she offered. "Billy can stay with us during the day. I'm teaching Margaret anyway. One more child won't matter." "Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears. "I can't pay. I didn't ask for payment. We're neighbors. This is what neighbors do." Soon, Clara was caring for several children while their families worked to save what they could of their livelihoods. Her kitchen became a makeshift school again, filled with the sound of children's voices reciting lessons while she prepared meals and managed the ranch books. "You can't save everyone," Silas warned gently, finding her one evening surrounded by sleeping children while she darned socks by lamplight. "I'm not trying to save everyone," Clara replied, "just the ones in front of me." The breakthrough came in late October. Clara woke to the sound of rain on the roof, not the brief teasing showers they'd had, but a steady, soaking rain. She and Silas stood on the porch, Margaret between them, watching the miracle fall from the sky. "We made it," Silas said, wonder in his voice. "Together?" Clara added, leaning into his strength. The rain continued for 3 days, filling streams and water barrels, bringing the scorched earth back to life. It would take time to fully recover, but they would recover. The families who'd stayed would be stronger for having weathered the crisis together. As winter approached, bringing its own challenges but also the promise of snow to further replenish the water table, Clara stood before her looking glass, preparing for the Thanksgiving service. The woman who looked back bore little resemblance to the frightened girl who'd fled Millbrook 3 years ago. Her face was sun-weathered now, tiny lines around her eyes from squinting across the grasslands. Her hands were rough from work, marked by the fire's blisters turned to calluses. But her bearing was straight, her gaze direct. She'd earned her place here through sweat and courage, love and determination. "Pretty, Mama," Margaret said, wrapping chubby arms around Clara's skirts. "Thank you, darling," Clara said, lifting her daughter. "Shall we go thank God for rain?" The church was packed, families who'd survived the drought together now celebrating together. Clara took her place beside Silas, Margaret on her lap, and felt the deep contentment of belonging. When they sang the old hymns, her voice rose strong and clear. After the service, Adelaide Morrison approached, the woman who'd once tried to drive Clara from town. "I owe you an apology," she said stiffly. "You've proved yourself a true neighbor, a true friend. I was wrong about you." Clara extended her hand. "We all deserve second chances. Mrs. Morrison, I'm grateful for mine." That evening, the ranch house filled with neighbors sharing a communal Thanksgiving meal. Clara moved among them, serving, laughing, listening to their stories of survival and hope. Thomas played his fiddle while children danced. Old Jake told tall tales that grew taller with each cup of cider. "You did this," Silas murmured, catching Clara in a quiet moment. "Built this community." "We did this," she corrected. "All of us. Together." As the evening wound down and families prepared to leave, each stopped to thank Clara personally. For the food, yes, but more. For the help during the drought, the care for their children, the example of resilience she'd provided. After the last guest departed, Clara sat by the fire, Margaret asleep in her arms. The house was quiet except for the crackling flames and Silas's steady breathing beside her. She thought of all the paths that had led to this moment, the pain and shame that had driven her west, the love that had given her courage to stay, the trials that had forged her into who she'd become. "Any regrets?" Silas asked softly, echoing his question from their wedding night. Clara smiled, thinking of the schoolhouse that would reopen next week with full enrollment, the neighbors who'd become family, the husband who'd given her a chance when no one else would, the daughter who'd never know shame for her mother's past. "Not one," she said firmly. "Not anymore." Outside, the November wind howled across the plains, but inside the Callahan house, all was warmth and peace. The blacksmith sister, who'd sought refuge in a rancher's employ, had found so much more: love, purpose, community, and the knowledge that she'd earned her place through courage and compassion. As Clara carried Margaret to bed, she paused at the window. Snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season, covering the fire-scarred earth in pristine white. A new beginning, as every snowfall was. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was simply grateful for second chances, for the courage to take them, for the love that made everything else possible. The story of Clara Callahan, teacher, mother, neighbor, survivor, would be told in Clay Ridge for generations. The woman who'd arrived in shame and stayed to become the heart of a community. The proof that redemption isn't just possible. Sometimes, it's magnificent, in the warmth of her home, surrounded by love. Clara smiled and began planning tomorrow's lessons. There was always more work to be done, more lives to touch, more hope to nurture, and she wouldn't have it any other way. Thank you for listening to this story of love, redemption, and resilience in the American frontier. Where are you enjoying this tale from? Please share your thoughts and let us know your location in the comments below so we can connect with listeners around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel and tell us what touched your heart in Clara and Silas's journey. Your stories and feedback mean everything to us.